My name is Janet, and I am going to tell you about the day I turned my father's funeral into a courtroom where justice was finally served. This is the story of how my manipulative stepfamily tried to steal everything from me, and how I used their own greed and lies to destroy them completely. My father remarried when I was 16, 5 years after my mother passed away from cancer. Linda seemed sweet at first, a widow with 2 children of her own, Marcus, who was my age, and his younger sister Bethany. Dad was lonely and wanted to give me a complete family again. If only he had known what kind of people he was really bringing into our home. Linda was a master manipulator who played the grieving widow perfectly. She would cry at just the right moments, speak softly about missing her late husband, and shower my father with attention he had been craving since Mom died. Within 6 months, they were married, and Linda and her children moved into our family home. The house my mother had decorated, where all my childhood memories lived. At first, I tried to be welcoming. I wanted Dad to be happy, and I thought maybe having siblings would be nice. But it became clear very quickly that Linda and her children saw our home as their prize, not their family. They would whisper among themselves when Dad was not around, making plans about redecorating and changing things. Marcus would go through Dad's study when he thought no one was looking, and Bethany would ask inappropriate questions about Dad's business and assets. The worst part was watching Linda slowly poison my father against me. She was subtle about it, never direct enough that Dad would catch on. She would mention how I seemed distant, how I did not seem to accept her as my new mother, how maybe I needed space to adjust. Gradually, Dad started spending less time with me and more time with his new ready-made family. Linda's children were equally manipulative. Marcus would break things and blame me, knowing Dad would believe his word over mine since he was the golden stepchild trying so hard to fit in. Bethany would go through my room and steal small things. Jewelry from my mother, photos, keepsakes. Nothing Dad would notice missing, but enough to torment me. I tried to tell Dad what was happening, but Linda had done her job too well. He would get frustrated with me for not embracing our new family dynamic. He accused me of being jealous and immature. The distance between us grew wider every month, and by the time I graduated high school, I felt like a stranger in my own home. I moved out for college and tried to rebuild my relationship with Dad from a distance. We would have lunch once a month, and slowly things started to improve between us. But Linda made sure she was always present during family gatherings, steering conversations and making subtle comments to remind Dad of my supposed attitude problems. What I did not realize at the time was that Linda was playing a much longer game than I had imagined. While I was away at college and then starting my career, she was systematically isolating my father from his old friends, his business partners, even his own brother. She convinced him that people were just using him for his money, that his real family was right there at home with her and her children. Linda also began inserting herself into Dad's business affairs. She convinced him that she had a head for numbers and could help manage the household finances. Before long, she had access to his accounts, knew about his investments, and was signing checks on his behalf. Marcus got a job at Dad's company despite having no real qualifications, and Bethany received expensive gifts and tuition payments for her art school dreams. Meanwhile, I was working 60-hour weeks at my job, paying off student loans and trying to build my own life. When I would visit, I could see Dad looked tired and older, but Linda always had an explanation. He was working too hard, he was stressed about the business, he needed more family time to relax. The truth was Linda and her children were bleeding him dry, while making him think they were taking care of him. 3 years ago, Dad was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The news hit me like a truck, but when I rushed to be by his side, Linda was already managing everything. She had chosen his doctors, scheduled his treatments, and made herself his primary contact for all medical decisions. She told the medical staff that I lived far away and was too busy with work to be heavily involved. I fought to be more present during Dad's illness, taking time off work and staying at the house to help with his care. But Linda made it clear I was not welcome. She would schedule treatments and appointments when I could not be there, or change times at the last minute without telling me. She painted me as the absent daughter who only showed up when it was convenient. During one of my visits, when Dad was having a good day, he pulled me aside and told me something that gave me hope. He said he had been thinking about the past, about Mom, and about how proud he was of the woman I had become. He told me he had made sure I would be taken care of after he was gone, that he had not forgotten about his little girl. He also said something that seemed strange at the time. He told me to remember that he had always kept important documents in the safe behind Mom's painting in his study, and that I should remember the combination was Mom's birthday. He made me promise to remember that, and I thought he was just being sentimental about Mom. Dad passed away 4 months later. I was holding his hand when it happened, and Linda was nowhere to be found. She had gone home to shower and change clothes. His last words to me were that he loved me and that everything would be okay. The funeral was scheduled for the following week, and I threw myself into planning a service that would honor Dad properly. But Linda had other ideas. She wanted to control every aspect of the funeral, from the flowers to the guest list. She claimed that as his widow, she had the right to make these decisions. The reading of the will was scheduled for 2 days after the funeral. I was not particularly worried about inheritance. I just wanted to grieve my father and make sure he was honored properly. But what happened at that lawyer's office changed everything. Linda, Marcus, and Bethany sat on one side of the room looking smug and confident. I sat alone on the other side, still numb with grief. The lawyer, Mr. Harrison, had been Dad's attorney for over 20 years, and he looked uncomfortable as he began reading the will. According to the document, Dad had left the house and the majority of his assets to Linda. Marcus was to inherit the business, and Bethany would receive a substantial trust fund for her education and future. I was left with a small savings account, barely enough to cover funeral expenses. I was shocked, but what made my blood run cold was Linda's reaction. She was not surprised at all. She sat there nodding along as if she had heard all of this before. Marcus and Bethany were trying to look sad, but I could see them exchanging pleased glances. Something was very wrong. After the meeting, I drove straight to Dad's house. Linda had already changed the locks, but I still had my key to the back door. A spare that Dad had hidden for emergencies that Linda did not know about. I waited until they left for dinner, then snuck into Dad's study. Mom's painting was still hanging where it had always been, and behind it was the safe Dad had told me about. I entered Mom's birthday, and it opened immediately. Inside were several documents, including what looked like Dad's real will. My hands were shaking as I read through the pages. This will was dated just 2 months before Dad died, much more recent than the one read at the lawyer's office. In this version, I inherited the house and the majority of Dad's assets. Linda would receive a reasonable sum to support herself, and her children would get modest amounts for their futures. Generous, but not the fortune they had been expecting. But that was not the most shocking discovery in the safe. There were also bank statements showing large withdrawals over the past 3 years. Money that Linda had been transferring to accounts in her and her children's names. There were forged documents with Dad's signature, credit cards that had been opened without his knowledge, and most damning of all, there were recordings. Dad had apparently become suspicious of Linda's financial activities in his final months. He had installed a recording device in his study and had been documenting conversations. The recordings revealed Linda and her children discussing their plans to forge a new will, how they were going to contest any will that left me as the primary beneficiary, and how they had been systematically stealing from Dad for years. In one particularly chilling recording, Linda was telling Marcus how they needed to make sure I was kept away from Dad during his final weeks, so he could not change his mind about anything. In another, Bethany was laughing about how easy it had been to manipulate a lonely old man. I also found evidence that Linda had not been widowed when she met Dad. She had been divorced from her first husband, but told Dad that her ex had died in order to gain his sympathy. Her first husband was very much alive and had been paying child support for Marcus and Bethany, which Linda had been collecting while also getting money from Dad. The most devastating discovery was a letter Dad had written to me just weeks before he died. In it, he apologized for allowing Linda to come between us. He wrote that he had finally seen through her manipulation and realized how much he had hurt me. He begged my forgiveness and explained that he had made sure his real will was safely hidden where only I would find it. He also revealed that he had been secretly recording conversations because he suspected Linda was forging documents and stealing money. He had planned to confront her after he recovered from his treatment, but realized he was running out of time. The letter ended with him telling me how proud he was of me and how much he loved me. I sat in Dad's study crying and reading his letter over and over. Then the grief transformed into something else entirely. Pure, focused rage. Linda and her children had not just stolen money from my dying father. They had stolen his final months with me. They had isolated him, manipulated him, and made him doubt his own daughter's love. They had turned his illness into an opportunity for theft and betrayal. I spent the next week making copies of everything and consulting with my own attorney. The forged will was obvious once you knew what to look for. The signatures did not match Dad's handwriting from the same time period, and the legal language was inconsistent with how Dad spoke and wrote. My lawyer advised me to take everything to the police and let them handle the criminal charges while we dealt with the will contest in probate court. But I had a better idea. I wanted Linda and her children to face their judgment in front of everyone who had known and loved my father. Dad's funeral was planned for Saturday morning. It was going to be a large service. Dad had been well respected in the community, and many business associates, old friends, and family members would be attending. Linda had insisted on speaking at the service, wanting to play the grieving widow one last time. I called the funeral director and asked if I could also speak at the service. I told him I wanted to share some memories of Dad and play a special tribute video I had put together. He was happy to accommodate my request. I spent the next few days preparing my presentation. I compiled the most damning recordings into a short audio montage, interspersed with photos of the forged documents and bank statements. I also included excerpts from Dad's letter to me, where he expressed his regret about how Linda had manipulated him. The morning of the funeral, the church was packed. Linda sat in the front row wearing an expensive black dress, probably bought with Dad's money, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Marcus and Bethany flanked her, both looking appropriately somber. Several people spoke about Dad's kindness, his business acumen, and his love for family. Then Linda took the podium. She gave a beautiful speech about what a wonderful husband Dad had been, how grateful she was for their time together, and how she would honor his memory by taking care of his legacy. She talked about Dad's generosity, his big heart, and how he had welcomed her and her children into his life with open arms. She even managed to work in a subtle dig about how she wished his relationship with his daughter had been stronger, but that she understood some family dynamics were complicated. The congregation was moved by her performance. People were crying, nodding along, and I could see them looking at me with pity. The distant daughter who had not been there for her father in his final days. Then it was my turn to speak. I walked to the podium slowly, carrying my laptop and a small speaker. I looked out at the crowd of people who had loved my father, took a deep breath, and began. I started by thanking everyone for coming to honor Dad's memory. I talked about what kind of father he had been when I was growing up, how he had supported me through college, and how proud I was to be his daughter. Then I said that I had discovered some things since Dad's death that I felt the people who loved him should know about. I explained that Dad had been concerned about some activities happening in his household during his final months, and that he had taken steps to document what was happening. I could see Linda starting to look nervous in the front row. Marcus was whispering something to Bethany, and both of them were staring at me with growing alarm. I pressed play on the first recording. Dad's voice filled the church. Weak from illness but clearly audible. He was talking to Linda about money that had gone missing from one of his accounts. Linda's voice could be heard clearly as she gave some excuse about medical expenses and promised to show him the receipts later. The congregation was confused at first, but they were listening intently. I let that recording play for about 30 seconds, then paused it. I explained that Dad had made these recordings because he suspected someone was stealing from him. I said that what they were about to hear was difficult, but that Dad had wanted the truth to come out. Then I played the recording where Linda and Marcus were discussing the forged will. The church went dead silent as Linda's voice filled the space, talking about how they needed to make sure the fake will looked legitimate, and how they would split Dad's assets among themselves. Marcus could be heard agreeing and suggesting ways to make sure I would not contest the will. I watched Linda's face go white as her own words echoed through the church. She started to stand up, probably to leave, but the people around her were staring at her in shock, and she seemed frozen in place. I played one more recording. The one where Bethany was laughing about manipulating Dad, and talking about how easy it would be to get rid of me once he was dead. By this point, The entire congregation was staring at Linda and her children in horror. I could hear people whispering angrily, and several of Dad's old friends were looking at Linda with disgust. But I was not finished. I pulled up the copies of the forged documents on my laptop and projected them onto the screen that had been set up for the service. I showed the fake will compared to Dad's real will, pointing out the differences in handwriting and legal language. I displayed the bank statements showing the systematic theft that had been going on for years. I showed the credit cards that had been opened in Dad's name without his knowledge, and the accounts where Linda had been transferring stolen money. Then I read excerpts from Dad's letter to me. My voice was steady as I read his words of apology, his explanation of how he had finally seen through Linda's manipulation, and his expression of love for me. When I read the part where he begged my forgiveness for allowing someone to come between us, there was not a dry eye in the church, except for Linda's table. Linda finally found her voice and stood up, shouting that I was lying and that everything I was showing was fake. She claimed I was just bitter about being left out of the will, and was trying to destroy her reputation. But Marcus made a critical error. He stood up and started yelling at me to stop, saying that I could not prove any of it, and that Dad had wanted them to have his money. His words were essentially a confession, and everyone in the church heard it clearly. Dad's brother stood up from his seat and called Linda a thief and a fraud. Other people started voicing their anger and disgust. Linda and her children found themselves surrounded by a room full of people who now knew exactly what kind of people they really were. But I still had one more surprise. I had done some additional research on Linda's background, and I had discovered that she had done this before. Her first marriage had ended because she had been caught stealing from her elderly mother-in-law. There had been charges filed, though they were later dropped when the money was returned. I had also found her real first husband, who was very much alive and very interested to learn that his ex-wife had been telling people he was dead. He had been happy to provide me with documentation of Linda's past behavior, and had already contacted his lawyer about the child support fraud. I announced to the congregation that I had turned over all the evidence to both the police and the district attorney's office. I explained that Linda and her children would be facing charges for forgery, theft, fraud, and elder abuse. The church erupted in voices as people expressed their outrage and support for me. Several of Dad's friends approached me immediately, apologizing for believing Linda's stories about me being distant, and offering to help in any way they could. Linda, Marcus, and Bethany tried to leave quickly, but they found their path blocked by angry mourners who were not ready to let them escape quietly. Dad's business partner told Linda she was no longer welcome at the company, and that Marcus would be fired immediately. Other people were calling them thieves and fraudsters. Linda was crying, real tears this time, but tears of panic and humiliation rather than fake grief. Marcus was trying to argue with people, still maintaining that they had done nothing wrong. Bethany was sobbing and claiming she had just gone along with her mother's plans. They finally managed to push through the crowd and leave, but the damage was done. Everyone who had ever respected Linda now knew exactly what she was. The police were waiting for them when they got home. The legal proceedings took several months, but the evidence was overwhelming. Linda was convicted of multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution. Marcus received 3 years for his role in the scheme, and Bethany got probation and community service since she was younger and had played a smaller role. The fake will was thrown out immediately, and Dad's real will was probated without any issues. I inherited the house and the majority of his assets, just as he had intended. But the best part of my revenge was not the legal consequences or getting my inheritance back. The best part was that Linda's reputation was destroyed completely and permanently. Word of what had happened at the funeral spread throughout the community quickly. She lost all her friends, her social standing, and any sympathy people might have had for her as a widow. When she was released from prison, she had to move to another state because everyone in town knew what she had done. Marcus could not find work anywhere locally because his name was associated with the scandal. Bethany had to transfer schools because her classmates and professors had heard about her family's crimes. I kept Dad's house and turned his study into a memorial room with photos of our family and some of his favorite books. I read his letter to me whenever I miss him, and I am grateful every day that he took steps to protect me and expose the people who had hurt him. The money Linda and her children stole was returned with interest, and I used part of it to establish a scholarship fund in Dad's name for students who, like me, had to work their way through college. It felt like the perfect way to honor his memory and turn something negative into something positive. Sometimes people ask me if I feel bad about exposing Linda and her children so publicly at the funeral. My answer is always the same. They chose to use Dad's funeral as their victory lap, assuming they had gotten away with their crimes. I simply made sure the truth was told in the same venue where they had planned to celebrate their theft. Linda had spent years destroying my relationship with my father and stealing from him while he was dying. She had turned his illness into an opportunity for personal gain and had isolated him from the daughter who loved him. She deserved every consequence she faced, and I have no regrets about making sure she faced them publicly. The last thing I want to share is what I learned from this experience. Family is not always about blood, and the people who claim to love you the most can sometimes be the ones who hurt you the worst. But truth has a way of coming to light eventually, and justice might be delayed, but it is rarely denied completely. Dad's real legacy was not the money or the house. It was the love he had for me and the steps he took to protect me even when he was dying. Linda thought she had won by manipulating him and stealing his assets, but in the end, love and truth were stronger than her lies and greed. And that is a lesson worth more than any inheritance. If this story of family betrayal and ultimate justice resonated with you, make sure to subscribe to Revenge Janet for more incredible tales of karma and revenge. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story where the truth prevails and justice is served. Share this video with anyone who believes that no matter how long it takes, the truth always comes to light. Remember, at Revenge Janet, we believe that karma never forgets an address, and justice is always worth fighting for. Subscribe now and join our community where betrayal meets its match.